Prime Minister Mark Carney's first federal budget is just 1 month away, and according to the interim parliamentary budget officer, the deficit number is shaping up to be ugly. At a parliamentary committee last week, Jason Jacques issued a dire warning.
We project the budgetary deficit will be $68.5 billion. That's billion with a B. We project the federal debt to GDP ratio will be 42.5% of GDP this year.
How alarming is that for the average Canadian, for the taxpayer? Because there is only one taxpayer, right?
Stupefying, shocking, right? This is not, it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook.
Are we closer to where we were in the mid-90s than we were 10 years ago?
The numbers in the mid-90s were far more alarming. If we don't change things, we're going to end up there again.
When do you project the budget to be balanced?
Is that a trick? Is that a trick question? a very long time. Again, the current status quo is not sustainable.
Well, as Jacques mentioned there, the PBO projects the deficit will jump to $68.5 billion next year, and it will stay above $60 billion for several years to come. That would be enough to change one of Canada's key so-called fiscal anchors, the debt to GDP ratio. Now, the Trudeau Liberals were committed to keeping the size of Canada's debt compared to the size of the economy in decline in the medium term. But under the PBO's projection, that ratio will rise above 43%. Kevin Page is a former parliamentary budget officer and president of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Kevin Page, always good to see you. Thank you for coming in, sir.
Good to be with you.
We're not going to see the federal budget for another month, but there's a lot of firm opinions on it well in advance. How fair is the PBO's assessment that the fiscal situation is stupefying and not sustainable?
Yeah, I don't agree with those words. The deficit definitely is going up from 2024-25. I think that the numbers that were in the PBO document are probably close to what the Prime Minister will see as his baseline, the Minister of Finance. So it is a higher deficit than we've seen in a while. But it's you put the deficit and debt in perspective. We're not in a bad place with respect to other countries. With respect to our credit rating, we're actually in a pretty good place.
The phrase "not sustainable," that is one that jumps out to me, right? Stupefying means whatever you want it to mean, but sustainability has a very specific meaning when it comes to government finances and the state of the budget. And I'm not trying to suggest the numbers are good, but they've been far worse in the past, in the 1990s, for example. So where are you on the sustainability definition of where things are?
Yeah, so I think we need to see the budget, and we'll see the Minister of Finance, the Prime Minister's, the measures. There'll be some version of what we saw on the platform, so it'll be a higher deficit track going out. I think the definition that economists, bond raters use for sustainability is usually looking at the debt of the country, the accumulated deficit, and relative to the size of the economy. So what we see over the medium term right now in terms of this baseline is a very modest increase in the debt to GDP ratio, then it stabilizes. I think the analysis that we've seen from finance, from the PBO, from IMF last year is that Canada is fiscally sustainable. I don't think that's going to change when we see the numbers from Prime Minister Carney and Minister Champagne.
Okay, so the outlook from the parliamentary budget officer assumes no new measures are introduced, and it doesn't include potential savings from the spending review that's been going on. It does not, yeah. Yes. That will really kick in next year. But it also doesn't include the future commitments on defense spending and getting to 5% to meet the NATO target. So there is a real potential for this to change. But in the short term, on the spending review and new measures, I mean, how much deviation do you think we could see in a month?
Yeah, I think, we're going to see a first installment of the spending review package in the budget. And, so they've been working, the government department's been working on over the summertime. We'll see, preliminary, measures. I think in the platform they talked about getting $30 billion over 4 years. I think with this, with a weaker economy and with the NATO commitments and the commitment to get to an operating balance in 4 years, they're going to need to do more spending cuts, some more reallocation. And, we'll see some of that in this budget, but we'll see it in future budgets as well. It's not an environment to raise taxes, so the Prime Minister, Finance Minister are going to work hard to cut spending.
Well, they've already cut a bunch of taxes this year too, right? Income tax, capital gains inclusion, and digital services tax, amongst others. But you talked about the weakening economy, and we talk about a growing deficit. So both of those things are connected. I mean, is the bigger pressure on the deficit spending, or is it the revenue hit that's been caused by all this disruption by the U.S. trade war?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, I think the outlook now for this year and next year from the PBO, from the OECD, from the Bank of Canada, is kind of growth in the 1% range. That's very slow growth. That means we're operating well below our potential. So in that environment, it's not unusual to see a deficit. It's not a deficit is quite natural. In fact, it's helpful to help stabilize the economy. So I think it's definitely both. We've seen, it's been the previous government under Prime Minister Trudeau definitely, increased spending at a pretty fast clip. Particularly in that area of other transfers, grants and contributions. So we're going to need to kind of slow the growth of that part of the budget.
They had a fiscal anchor under the Trudeau government. That was the debt to GDP ratio. The commitment was that it would decline over time, and for various reasons, it moved and got missed and these sorts of things. Prime Minister Carney insists he has them. We don't know exactly what those are going to be. I mean, what markers should we be looking for in the budget to see whether this is a responsible and sustainable plan?
Well, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, they committed to get to something called an operating balance. So we're not going to be deficit financing current consumption, current spending. All the big transfers to persons, other levels of government, the grants and contributions that are going to be consumed in the current year, they're going to be paid for. So that's effectively an operating balanced budget. I think the Prime Minister said, the Minister of Finance said, we'll run small deficits, less than 2 percentage points of GDP for capital investment only. They're going to define, they will see the definition in the budget. And to me, if they could hit that target, we'll have a declining debt to GDP ratio. I think in addition to that target, I think it would be useful for them to have some commitments along the way in terms of hitting targets, nominal balances, what will the deficit be next year, the year after. They could have spending control in certain parts of the budget to help us feel more confident. They could build reserves in as well in terms of getting to that target. But overall, it's not a bad fiscal picture. Every country, because of the weaker global economy, because of the NATO commitments, every country is experiencing some upward deficit pressure right now.
Right. Well, but okay, overall, it's not a bad fiscal picture. Former parliamentary budget officer saying that versus stupefying and not sustainable. You see the political arguments that sort of assessment has unleashed. I mean, when Canadians hear that, we see the opposition raising concerns about Canada's AAA credit rating maybe being at risk because of this. I mean, what should they think?
Well, I think the language from the current parliamentary budget officer, Mr. Jason Jacques, is just wrong. And he should walk that back, quite frankly. He should tell people that our fiscal situation is sustainable. And I think that the other language of those other words, stupefy, shocking. It's not you wouldn't see a governor of the Bank of Canada or the Auditor General use that kind of language. So I think that's not the right language. And so I'm sure Mr. Jacques will change. We'll see less of that kind of language. I think it's definitely inflamed certain passions around Canada's fiscal situation that I think are not consistent with the numbers.
Right, so it's not the type of language I've heard you use. It's not the type of language I presume you would have used. But does it distort how bad things are? Because, I mean, they aren't great. They are challenging. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with that. But it's not the Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien crisis of the 90s.
Yeah, and that crisis was dealt with, and Canada was put really was given a fiscal advantage thanks to Prime Ministers Chrétien and Martin. Again, if you look at the numbers right now, a deficit, a baseline deficit of about a little over 2 percentage points. That's a third of what it is in the U.S. and the U.K., and it's well below the OECD average. If you look at our deficit, our debt, debt to GDP ratio, we're probably it'll be the lowest of the G7. If you look at the carrying costs of debt, interest charges divided by revenues, it's 11 cents on every revenue dollar right now. That is a third of what it was for Prime Minister Chrétien and Martin, and we're a AAA country. So, where do you see, shocking? It's not shocking to see a deficit go up because the economy is slowing and we have NATO commitments. To me, it's sustainable. I think when they do the analysis, everybody's going to do this analysis, including finance. We'll see it in the budget. We're sustainable right now.
You said, just as a final point, you think maybe they should walk it back, the PBO. Have you suggested that to them? Have you talked to them about it? Have you had any response to them? What have they said?
I think they recognize it's a mistake, and I think that's the easy part. I think the part, I think, of kind of walking it back, I think that'll be good for the institution. I think they have to walk it back.
Former Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Good to be with you.